Welcome back to the deep dive. We're doing something a little bit different today. Usually we take this really wide-angle lens to a topic, a war, a massive movement, some huge technological shift. But today we are zooming way, way in.
Right, zooming into literally just a single word.
Yeah, a single word, two characters to be exact.
Yeah.
Which sounds really small when you put it that way.
It does sound small, but the stack of research we're going through today suggests that these two characters are, well, they're anything but small.
No kidding. I mean, we're talking about a linguistic fossil here, something that unlocks a history spanning over 3,000 years. It connects Bronze Age star movements to ancient political coups and eventually lands us right in the middle of a massive theological war between the Pope in Rome and the Emperor in Beijing.
It really is wild. It's a term that feels incredibly ancient, almost mythical, and yet it's a word that millions of people use today, like this very morning, in their private prayers. And that word is Shangdi.
Shangdi, which roughly translates to highest deity or Lord above.
Right. Exactly. Highest deity. And the reason we are diving into this today isn't just to give you a linguistics lesson. It's because the story of Shangdi is really the story of how humanity's relationship with power has evolved, both divine power and political power.
I think what really drew me to this topic in the source material is that when you usually think of mythology or ancient religion, you think of these static stories. Zeus is always on his mountain, Thor always has his hammer.
Right, the characters are locked in.
Exactly. But the story of Shangdi is this story of intense evolution. It feels more like a detective story, or honestly, almost like a corporate takeover than a religious text.
A corporate takeover is the perfect way to frame it. We are going to see how this tribal protector god became a moral force for the entire universe, and then basically a celestial map, and finally the center of this massive debate in the Christian world about how we even define the word God.
So just to keep us on track here, because this research really does go everywhere, let's set a quick roadmap for you. We are going to start way back in the Shang dynasty, 2nd millennium BC. We have to figure out who Shangdi was when he first showed up on the scene.
And from there, we'll move into what we can call the Great Merger. This is when the Zhou dynasty takes over and pulls off, frankly, one of the greatest rebranding campaigns in human history just to justify their rule.
I love that part. And then, and this is a section I'm really curious to unpack, we're going to look at the stars. We've got some fascinating research from David Pankenier and J.C. Didier connecting this deity to the actual physical layout of the cosmos and the North Pole.
Which is mind-blowing. And finally, we'll fast forward to the 1600s. The Jesuits, the missionaries, all trying to figure out how to translate the Bible into Chinese and why this specific word caused such a massive headache for the Vatican.
It's a lot of ground. But let's just jump right in at the very beginning. Who or what is Shangdi? Let's start with the name itself. Break that down for us.
So linguistically, it's quite potent. The first character, Shang, it means high, highest, first, or primordial. It implies this strict vertical hierarchy. It's all about being above everything else.
Okay.
And the second character, Dai, translates to Lord or deity. So you put it together, you get highest deity or Lord on high.
Now, I noticed in the notes that Dai is the exact same character used in Huangdi, which means emperor, like Qin Shi Huang, the guy who unified China and built the Terracotta Army.
That's true, but we really have to be careful with the timeline there. The usage of Dai for human emperors came much, much later.
Really?
Yeah. Originally, back in the Shang dynasty, Dai referred specifically to the manifest god. It was a purely divine title, not a human one. When the human emperors eventually took that title centuries later, they were essentially borrowing the gravity of that ancient divine name.
Okay, so it's like a king calling himself a god king. You're just co-opting that supernatural authority to boost your own poll numbers, basically.
Exactly. They were calling themselves the sons of heaven, explicitly linking their political authority back to this original day. But if we go back to the Bronze Age, to the Shang era, which is roughly 1600 to 1046 BC, Shangdi was not a human. He was the boss.
The boss. Okay, so let's look at his job description. It's the Bronze Age, life is fragile, civilization is just clinging to the banks of the Yellow River. What was Shangdi actually responsible for day to day?
Everything that mattered. In the Shang dynasty, Shangdi was the ultimate spiritual power. But we need to clear up a major misconception right now. He was not necessarily this benevolent, warm and fuzzy grandfather figure sitting on a cloud. He was an absolute powerhouse.
Right.
He controlled victory in battle. If your tribe lost a war against a neighboring group, it wasn't just because of bad military strategy. It was because Shangdi specifically willed you to lose.
So he's essentially a war god.
A war god, yes, but also an agricultural god. He determined the success of the harvest, and obviously, in an early agricultural society, that is literally a matter of life or death.
Yeah, if the crops fail, the entire dynasty fails.
Precisely. And he controlled the weather. Specifically, the floods of the Yellow River. Now, you have to remember, the Yellow River is historically known as China's sorrow.
Because it floods so unpredictably.
Right. If it floods just the right amount, you get this beautiful, fertile silt and amazing crops. If it floods too much, it completely wipes out your capital city. And Shangdi had his hand firmly on that tap.
Wow. So he really is the CEO of the universe. He's managing the profit and loss of the entire kingdom.
In a way, yes. And like any powerful CEO, he had a whole hierarchy underneath him. Shangdi ruled over a vast court of nature gods, spirits of the wind, the clouds, the rain, and crucially, he ruled over the spirits of the deceased.
Okay, but here's the part that I found really striking in the source material, and I want to drill down on this for a second. The sources explicitly say that Shangdi was considered too distant to be worshipped directly, which feels completely counterintuitive to me. If he's the big boss, and I really need it to rain, don't I want to talk directly to him?
You might want to, but in Shang theology, you simply couldn't. He was way too transcendent. He was too powerful. The gap between a mortal, even a living king, and Shangdi was just vastly too wide. Think about it like an unpaid intern trying to just casually walk into the CEO's top floor office to ask for a fundamental change in corporate strategy. You just don't do that.
Right, you get fired immediately. Or in this case, smited.
Exactly, smited. So you need middle management.
You need lobbyists.
You need lobbyists. And the middle management in the Shang religious system was the royal ancestors.
Ah, the ancestors. So this is where the famous Chinese concept of ancestor worship really comes into play.
Right here. The Shang kings would pray to their ancestors, their grandfathers, the legendary kings of the past. And those ancestors, because they were now spirits dwelling in the divine realm, actually had access to the court of Shangdi. They could approach the throne.
Got it. So they would basically put in a good word for you.
Yes, they would entreat Shangdi on behalf of the living king.
It's literally a bureaucracy of the dead.
It really is. It's a deeply transactional, bureaucratic system. You offer sacrifices to your deceased grandfather, you treat his memory well, and you just hope he uses his political capital with the big boss to get you that rain you need.
And what's amazing is that we know this not just from some vague stories passed down through the generations, but from hard physical evidence. The oracle bones.
Yes, the oracle bones. This is honestly one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history, found mostly in the ruins of Yingsu, which was the last capital of the Shang dynasty.
I really want you to describe this process for us, because I think people hear the phrase oracle bones, and it sounds very mystical, like throwing some chicken bones in a dusty bowl.
Yeah.
But the actual mechanics of it, according to the sources, were highly technical, almost industrial.
Oh, it was incredibly technical. They practiced a specific type of divination called scapulomancy. They would take the shoulder blades of oxen, or sometimes they used the plastrons, which are the flat bottom shells of turtles. And they wouldn't just toss them in a fire. They would carefully clean them, scrape them down until they were a very uniform thickness, and then polish them.
So this is serious prep work. This isn't impromptu.
But very serious prep work. It took a lot of time. Then the diviners would drill these highly organized rows of hollows, or little pits, into the back of the bone. Not drilling all the way through, mind you, just deep enough to leave a very thin, fragile layer of bone on the front side.
And then comes the heat.
Right. During the actual ritual, they would take a glowing hot metal rod or a burning hardwood brand and apply it directly into those pre-drilled hollows.
And the heat makes it crack.
Exactly. The rapid, intense expansion of the material would cause the bone to fracture on the smooth front side. And the shape of that crack, the exact angle, the length, whether it branched off, that was read by the royal diviner as the literal voice of the ancestor, or the will of Shangdi himself.
And the sound of it, too. I read in the notes that the sound of the crack was actually really important.
Yes. The old Chinese word for divination in this specific context is bu. And it's actually an onomatopoeia. It's meant to mimic the exact sound of that bone cracking under the heat, like a sharp pop or a poo sound.
That is just fascinating. So the king isn't just making a wild guess or having a dream. He's basically running a diagnostic test on the universe.
And the questions they were asking weren't just personal trivia. These were matters of state. Will it rain this week? Will we win this upcoming battle against the King tribe? Is the millet harvest going to fail?
High stakes.
Incredibly high stakes. And the inscriptions they carved onto these bones after the ritual, they record the date, the diviner's name, the exact question asked, and very often they recorded the final result of what actually happened later.
It's a government archive.
It is the literal minutes of the royal meeting with the divine. And what becomes crystal clear from reading these records is that Shangdi is sitting at the very top of the pyramid. He is the ultimate one who sends down the mandate. But he is scary.
Scary.
Well, he sends down disasters, plagues, enemy raids. He is not a god you love in the modern sense. He is a god you deeply fear and respect. He represents absolute, unyielding authority.
Okay, so Shangdi is this distant, powerful, frankly terrifying figure at the top of the cosmic org chart. But then we hit this massive turning point in Chinese history. The Shang dynasty falls. The Zhou dynasty takes over. And this isn't just a simple change in management. It's a full-on clash of cultures.
It is. The transition from the Shang to the Zhou is absolutely pivotal. We're talking about the year 1046 BC, specifically the Battle of Muye. The Zhou were people from the western frontiers, and they completely conquered the Shang. Now, usually when you conquer a people in the ancient world, you destroy their gods.
Right, that's standard operating procedure. My god beat your god, so your god is fake. Bow down to ours.
Exactly. But the Duke of Zhou, who is the brother of the first Zhou king and essentially the chief architect of this brand new dynasty, he did something so much smarter. He realized that the Shang people, who were very numerous and culturally sophisticated, had been worshipping Shangdi for centuries.
You can't just wipe that out overnight without causing a massive rebellion.
You really can't. It builds too much resentment. So instead of destroying the god, you need a merger. You need to essentially acquire their theological intellectual property.
Okay, so how do they pull that off? Because the Zhou had their own god.
They did.
Yeah.
The Zhou people had their own concept of the supreme cosmic power, which they called Tian, which is usually translated into English as heaven. But Tian wasn't quite a personified, distinct entity like Shangdi was. It was a bit more abstract, more like a cosmic force or the sky itself.
So now you have these two supreme deities floating around. The Shang people have Shangdi, and the new Zhou rulers have heaven. How do they resolve that?
They conflated them. They aggressively promoted the idea that Shangdi and heaven were, in fact, the exact same thing. They effectively went to the Kang people and said, hey, you know that High Lord you've been worshiping this whole time? We worship him too. We just happen to call him heaven.
That is just brilliant political rebranding. It instantly unifies the religious base. It lets them say, look, we aren't foreign invaders overturning your world. We serve the exact same boss you do.
It was brilliant. But they didn't just merge the names, they added a crucial new twist to the theology. And this is the concept that ends up defining Chinese political history for the next 3,000 years, the mandate of heaven.
Okay, let's really unpack this one, because I think a lot of people hear mandate of heaven, and they instantly equate it to the divine right of kings, like what we saw in Europe. But it's actually quite different, isn't it?
It is fundamentally different. In Europe, the divine right of kings generally meant that the king was God's appointed representative on earth, period. So you couldn't overthrow him no matter how terrible he was, because he answered only to God. But the mandate of heaven is strictly conditional.
Conditional, like there's a performance contract.
Yes, exactly like a contract. Remember, under the Shang, Shangdi was basically a tribal protector. He looked out for the Shang people because they were his specific bloodline. It was cosmic nepotism. The Zhou completely changed that dynamic. They rebranded Shangdi, or heaven, as a universal moral force.
Oh, I see. So he stops playing favorites based on family ties and starts judging the ruler based on their actual behavior.
Exactly. The argument the Zhou made to the conquered people was this. The Shang kings didn't lose the throne because they were militarily weak. They lost the throne because they were wicked.
The propaganda writes itself.
It does. They claimed the last Shang kings were drunkards, they were cruel, they tortured people. Basically, they lost their virtue. And Shangdi, being a purely moral force, withdrew his mandate to rule from the Shang and handed it over to the Zhou. Why? Because the Zhou were virtuous.
That is the ultimate airtight justification for a violent coup. We didn't steal your kingdom. God gave it to us because you were terrible employees.
It legitimizes the usurpation completely. But, and this is the genius part, it also puts a massive burden on the new rulers themselves.
Because the rules apply to them now, too.
Right. If you claim that you have the right to rule simply because you are virtuous, then you actually have to be virtuous. Because if you start acting corrupt, heaven can absolutely take the mandate away from you and give it to the next rebel army.
It creates a built-in system of accountability, a cosmic checks and balances system.
Exactly. And to really cement this new reality, the Zhou court actually adopted a lot of the old Shang religious practices. They even kept members of the Shang aristocracy alive and housed them in a special ceremonial city just so they could continue to maintain the ancient sacrifices.
Wow, they really wanted to make it look seamless.
They wanted to make it look like D was native to them, too, and it worked. By the Western Zhou period, you look at the bronze inscriptions and you see the terms D and Tian being used completely synonymously and interchangeably.
So deity became less of a tribal father figure and much more of an abstract, universal moral standard. But that original connection to the High Lord up in the sky still remained.
Yes, it did. And this brings us to what I think is the most visual, tangible part of our investigation today. We've talked about the politics, we've talked about the theology, now I want to talk about astronomy.
Yes. This is the section covering the research from David Pankinier and J.C. Didier. And this is where the detective work gets really incredible to me. Because the claim they make here is that Shangdi wasn't just an abstract idea or a political tool, he was something you could actually physically look up and see.
This is genuinely one of the most fascinating theories in the entire field of archaeoastronomy. Pankinier and others have spent years looking at the absolute obsession the early Shang and Xia cultures had with the night sky. Their palaces, their tombs, their temples, everything was painstakingly aligned to the stars.
And specifically, aligned to the North Pole. But, and this is a really important technical point we need to clarify for you listening, it's not the North Star we have today, right?
Correct. We live on a planet that wobbles on its axis. Due to a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, the Earth's axis actually points at different stars over a massive cycle of about 26,000 years.
Right, so today our axis points right at Polaris. That's our North Star.
But back in the Shang era, around 1600 BC, Polaris wasn't in that position. In fact, there wasn't a bright star exactly at the pole at all.
So what was there? If you looked exactly north, what did you see?
A void. What Pankinier refers to as a vacant apex.
A vacant apex? That just sounds ominous.
It does. It's a specific spot in the night sky that appears completely empty. It's darker than the rest of the sky. But if you watch the sky throughout the night, all the other stars rotate perfectly around this dark, empty center. It is the literal pivot of the universe, the one unmoving center.
That sounds incredibly theological just describing it. It's like the unmoved mover, the calm eye of the cosmic hurricane.
Exactly. And the theory here is that Shangdi was explicitly identified with this true celestial pole. He is the center of the cosmos. He is the invisible central force that makes the entire universe spin around him. He doesn't have to move, but everything else is forced to move around him.
And there's actual visual evidence for this in the writing system itself, right? In the ancient characters.
Yes. If you look closely at the ancient Shang script for the word Dai, the exact character they etched onto those cracking oracle bones we talked about earlier, it doesn't look like a person. It looks kind of like a scaffold, or maybe a stick figure with a prominent crossbar. Sometimes it even has these little lines or rays radiating out of it.
It looks like a structural framework.
What Pankinier did is show how you can take that ancient character and literally project it onto a map of the stars, exactly as they appeared at the North Pole during the Shang era.
And it fits.
It fits perfectly. The shape of the character aligns with the surrounding stars, specifically the handle of the Big Dipper and some of the other major circumpolar stars. And the exact intersecting center of the character crosses right at that dark, vacant pole.
That is just wild. So when a Shang diviner wrote down the word God, they were quite literally drawing a star map of the center of the sky.
That is the compelling argument. And it suddenly makes total sense of his title. Lord above, highest deity. He isn't just socially high. He is physically located at the highest, most central point of the heavens. It grounds the entire theology in physical, astronomical observation.
And there's also this deep analysis by J.C. Didier about the square shape often found in the character. Remember reading about this idea of the celestial square in the source text?
Yes, Didier's work takes this another step. The character for day often implies a square shape, or a sense of boxing something in. Didier argues that this represents the celestial square formed by the specific stars rotating around the pole. But crucially, it also perfectly mirrors the layout of the royal ancestral temple back down on Earth.
As above, so below. The physical temple on Earth is just a mirror reflection of the stars in the sky.
Precisely. And what was kept inside that square temple on Earth? The ancestral spirits. So this brings us right back to the idea of the ancestors. Didier suggests that Dia might not have even been conceived of as just one single guy.
Wait, really? Not a single deity?
Right. Because the square housed all the main lineage ancestors, Didier posits that Dai could have been a collective force, the sum total of all the great ancestors who had ascended and basically merged with that celestial pole.
So God is essentially a hive mind of spiritual power. Just all the great ancestors living together in the center of the sky, turning the universe.
Potentially, yes. And it perfectly explains why the Shang Kings felt they had to pray to their ancestors to reach Dai. The ancestors weren't just lobbyists, they were actually a part of Dai. They had merged with the pole.
That completely blows my mind. It totally changes the perspective from, a giant man sitting in a chair in the clouds to this massive, churning cosmic mechanism.
And the sources even mention a fascinating distinction found in some of the older inscriptions between a Shangdi, meaning high Dai, and a Xiadi, meaning low Dai.
High God and low God. What's the difference there?
It seems to differentiate between friendly spirits and hostile spirits. The high Dai might represent the benevolent royal ancestors who are aligned with the central pole and bring order, while the low Dai might be a category housing foreign gods or chaotic nature spirits that bring floods and disasters.
It just reflects such a complex, layered view of the supernatural world. It's not just a monolith, it's an entire working system.
It is a mechanism, a cosmic mechanism made of stars, ancestors, and raw power. And for thousands of years, this system kept evolving. It merged with Confucian thought, it merged with Taoism, and it became the absolute bedrock of Chinese state religion.
Which makes what happens next in our story even more surprising. Because we're going to jump forward a few thousand years now. The Shang dynasty is long gone. The Zhou dynasty is gone. We are now in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. It's the 1600s. And suddenly, here come the Jesuits.
Enter Matteo Ricci.
Matteo Ricci, who was a fascinating guy in his own right.
Very much so. Ricci and his fellow Jesuit missionaries arrive in China with a very clear, very singular mission: convert the vast Chinese populace to Catholic Christianity. But they immediately run face first into a massive linguistic hurdle.
Right. How do you translate the word God?
Exactly. It seems so simple to us, but it is fraught with extreme danger. In the West, the Christian concept of God is highly specific. He is omnipotent, he is the creator of the universe from nothing, he is personal, and he is entirely distinct from his creation.
But in China, you arrive and they have the emperor, they have the ancestors, they have the Buddha, they have the Tao, they have heaven. Which of those words do you pick?
And if you pick the wrong word, you accidentally tell millions of people to worship a ghost or a mountain. Or worse, from the church's perspective, a demon.
So what does Ricci do?
Well, Ricci was a scholar, so he starts reading through the ancient Chinese classics. He's literally reading the exact same stuff we were just talking about, the ancient texts from the Zhou and Shang eras.
He's doing the archaeolinguistic detective work.
He is. And he finds Shangdi. He sees this ancient, revered term for a supreme moral authority, the Lord of Heaven, the one who judges virtue, the one who famously punished the Shang dynasty for being wicked. And Ricci thinks, bingo, we found him.
It does seem like a perfect fit, honestly. It links the Christian God to the most ancient, most respectable Chinese tradition available. It allows Ricci to walk in and say, hey, I'm not bringing you some strange new foreign god from Europe. I'm actually bringing you back to your own original God, the one you used to worship perfectly.
That was exactly Ricci's strategy. It's a theological approach called accommodationism. He wanted to show that the ancient Chinese were essentially early monotheists who had just kind of lost their way over the centuries as Buddhism and Taoism got mixed in. Now, he initially used the term Tianzu, which means Lord of Heaven, but he strongly shifted toward promoting Shangdi specifically to appeal to the elite Confucian scholars. He wanted to sound intellectual. He wanted to show he deeply respected their classical culture.
But looking at the history, this did not go smoothly at all. This wasn't just a clever linguistic choice. It turned into an absolute war.
Oh, it sparked what is famously known as the Chinese rights controversy. And calling it a controversy is putting it incredibly mildly. This was a full-blown diplomatic and theological disaster.
So who exactly was fighting who here?
Well, on one side you had the Jesuits, and they're saying, look, Shangdi is God. We can use this word. We can respect these ancient traditions. We can let them keep honoring their ancestors. It's fine. It's a cultural bridge.
Okay. And the other side?
On the other side, you had other Catholic orders who arrived in China a bit later, primarily the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And they were much less, well, let's say they were less flexible.
They were the theological hardliners.
Very much so. They looked at the word Shangdi and they said, absolutely not. No way.
What was their specific objection, though? Was it just a petty turf war between different orders of monks?
It was definitely partly a turf war over influence, yes. But there was a very real, very deep theological disagreement at the core of it. The Dominicans argued that Shangdi, in the Chinese classics, is a governor. He orders the world. He manages the mechanisms of the universe.
Okay, but isn't that what the Christian God does too?
Yes, but in classical Chinese thought, the cosmos itself kind of exists eternally. Shangdi brings order to it, but he didn't necessarily create it ex nihilo. He didn't create it from absolutely nothing, which is a core tenet of the God of Genesis.
Ah, okay. That is a subtle but absolutely massive distinction. One is a cosmic manager organizing things. The other is the supreme architect who built the room from scratch.
Exactly. And the Dominicans were terrified that by using the name Shangdi, the new Chinese converts would just keep doing their traditional pagan ancestor worship and just mistakenly think it was the exact same thing as Catholicism. They thought Ricci was dangerously diluting the core theology. They straight up called it idolatry.
Wow. So they took the fight all the way up at the chain of command. They took it to the Supreme Court, the Vatican?
Yeah, they did. And it gets even crazier because the emperor of China at the time, the Kangxi emperor, who was a brilliant ruler, he actually weighed in on the debate.
The Chinese emperor got involved in a Catholic theology dispute.
Yes. He actually sided with the Jesuits. He wrote a declaration saying, look, these ancestor rituals are civil traditions. They aren't religious worship in the way you fear. We honor Shangdi as the highest authority of the universe. It's totally fine. You guys are overreacting.
But I'm guessing the Pope didn't really care what the Emperor of China thought about Catholic theology.
Not even a little bit. Pope Clement XI issued a definitive edict in 1715. He effectively said, stop using Shangdi right now. He strictly banned Catholics from using the term and forced them to universally adopt Tianzu, Lord of Heaven. And he also strictly banned any Chinese Christians from participating in any traditional ancestor worship rites.
Man, that must have gone over terribly with Emperor Kangxi.
It was a disaster. It ended up getting Christian missions functionally banned in China for a very long time. The emperor was profoundly insulted. He essentially said, how dare a foreign pope sitting in Italy tell my subjects how to speak their own language and honor their own families? If you can't respect our culture, get out.
So if you go to a Catholic mass in China today, centuries later, they still say Tianzu.
Mostly, yes. The Catholic Church stuck with Tianzu. But the story of Shangdi doesn't end there, because much later in the 19th century, the Protestant missionaries show up.
The British and American missionaries.
Right. And guess what? They run into the exact same translation problem, and they have the exact same massive debate all over again. It became known as the term question.
Did they reach a different conclusion?
They split on it. Some Protestant missionaries absolutely loved the word Shangdi. They loved it because it linked perfectly to this idea found in the Bible of the unknown God, this theological idea that God leaves a witness of himself in every human culture.
Oh, so they could say, the God you've been worshiping in ancient times, the one who ruled the stars, but you didn't fully know him, that's Yahweh. That's the God of the Bible.
Precisely. It was a very powerful evangelical message. Now, other Protestant missionaries fiercely preferred the word Shen.
Shen. What does that mean?
Shen is a much more generic Chinese word for a god or a spirit. It doesn't carry all that specific ancient imperial baggage that Shangdi does. But despite the pushback, Shangdi really stuck for many Protestants. They liked the sheer majesty of it. They liked that ancient High Lord authority it commanded.
So today, in the modern world, if I walk into a Chinese Protestant church in Beijing or Shanghai, and I open up a Standard Union Version Bible, what word am I going to see?
You will very likely see Shangdi used as the primary translation for God. And it's not just in the church. In modern secular Chinese media, too, when they translate a movie or an article referring to the God of the Abrahamic religions, they very often use Shangdi.
That is just an incredible irony. The Pope totally bans the word, causes a massive diplomatic incident, but it survives and thrives over in the Protestant tradition.
It really is a historical anomaly. It is one of the very rare examples in history of a distinct, ancient pagan deity's name being successfully co-opted and normalized for a monotheistic religion. Usually, when a new religion comes in, the old names are demonized. You know, Baal becomes a literal demon in Christian lore. Zeus is relegated to just being a myth.
Right, the old gods get demoted.
But here, the name was adopted elevated, and essentially sanctified.
Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you briefly mentioned in our roadmap at the start. The Temple of Heaven in Beijing.
Yeah.
Because this is where the physical worship of Shangdi actually took place by the emperors right up until the early 20th century. Right?
Yes, if you ever visit Beijing, you absolutely have to go. The Temple of Heaven complex is an architectural marvel, and it was built specifically, exclusively for the emperor to personally perform the annual sacrifices to Shangdi, or Heaven.
And what did that ritual actually look like in the later dynasties?
Yeah.
Because we started this whole conversation with the bloody cracking ox bones of the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Did the ritual completely change?
It became much more refined, much more visually spectacular, but the core theological elements were shockingly similar. And frankly, they were shockingly similar to the rituals described in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
This grand ceremony happened every year on the winter solstice.
The shortest day of the year.
Right. The emperor, after fasting and purifying himself, would go out to this magnificent round mound open-air altar. And a healthy bull, specifically a young calf entirely without blemish, would be slaughtered and burned as a whole, burnt offering to Shangdi.
A completely unblemished calf burned on an altar. That sounds exactly like the book of Leviticus.
The parallels are striking. The smoke rising up into the open sky to please the heavens. But here is the single most important detail about the Temple of Heaven, and it's the detail that those early missionaries really latched onto. Inside that vast temple complex, there were absolutely no idols.
Wait, no statues at all? No golden calves? No paintings of an old man with a white beard sitting on a cloud?
Nothing. In the Imperial Vault of Heaven, which is the most sacred building there was no statue of a god to bow to. There was only a spirit tablet. Just a simple vertical wooden plank, beautifully carved, sitting on a throne, and inscribed on that wooden plank was just the name, Huangqian Shangdi, Supreme Lord of the Great Heaven.
Just the name. Nothing else.
Just the name. And this visually reinforces that core idea of Shangdi as being completely abstract, completely transcendent, and entirely formless. He wasn't some guy you could carve into a piece of stone or cast in bronze. He was the ultimate invisible force beyond all form.
That really brings us full circle to that distant quality we talked about in the very beginning. He is so high up, so far beyond human comprehension, you can't even picture him. You just write his name on a piece of wood.
It does. And honestly, that brings us to the deep irony of how the word is used today. And I think this is really the ultimate takeaway of our entire episode.
Yeah, let's look at the big picture here, because the journey is wild. We started with a god who was basically the tough, uncompromising boss of the Shang dynasty, a tribal war god who controlled the river floods and demanded cracked turtle shells to answer questions.
Then he evolved. He became the universal moral judge of the Zhou dynasty, the absolute source of political legitimacy who could and would fire the emperor if he got too corrupt.
Then we looked at the stars and saw him as the literal pivot point of the night sky, the vacant apex of the universe, the dark mechanism that physically turns the heavens.
And finally, through this crazy twist of translation, cultural negotiation, and missionary zeal, he became the accepted name for the Christian God for millions of people.
And that leads perfectly into the final provocative thought I want to leave everyone listening with today. Think about this. The ancient Shang kings genuinely believed that Shangdi was far too distant, far too powerful to ever be worshipped by regular people. He was completely inaccessible.
Right, you needed a royal bloodline, or a deceased ancestor, or a burning bone just to get a basic message to his outer court. He was the CEO you could never, ever meet.
Yet today, right now, millions of Chinese Christians use that exact same ancient name, Shangdi, in highly personal, entirely private prayer. They whisper that name in their bedrooms. They cry out to it in moments of deep personal crisis.
It's incredible.
The name that was once the literal definition of unapproachable power has somehow become the name of the most personal, intimate, spiritual connection a believer can possibly have.
It's a fascinating linguistic and spiritual journey. From the cold, distant center of the North Star to the quiet intimacy of personal faith. It really shows that words are just containers.
Containers?
Yeah. They hold history, they hold intense political struggles, they hold maps of the stars, but the actual meaning poured inside them, that is always flowing, always changing with the people who use them.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up today's deep dive. Whether you're looking up at the stars tonight or just reading a history book, keep an eye out for those hidden connections. You really never know where tracking a single word might take you. Thanks for listening.
Always a pleasure to explore the depths with you. Until next time.